the last episode of our 6-part series. Hong Kong, the end of an era, refers to the end of 156 years of British rule. Actually, more than 50 years ago, the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek had wanted to take back the new territories. And later, the British had tried to perpetuate its administration of Hong Kong beyond 1997. In this last episode, we examine Britain's retreat from the territory.
I think the withdrawal of Britain is honourable. I think that's not a bad way to go out. Hong Kong is admired throughout the world. It's admired not just for its economic competitiveness, but it's admired for its way of life.
This was the last public concert at Government House. Hong Kong has travelled a long and winding road from the start of British rule 156 years ago to the dismantling of colonial insignias today. In the Second World War, defeated British troops retreated from Hong Kong. Concurrently, Hong Kong's fate hung in the balance in Sino-British talks held in Chongqing, China. The negotiations between the Allies were over the new territories. The Chinese nationalists wanted it back. They had the United States' support, but Britain resisted.
There would be practically no value in our retaining the island and the tip of Kowloon only, where we should be exposed to every sort of tail-twisting and effective obstruction from any Chinese authority.
So Britain suggested the issue be dealt with after the war's been won. Chiang Kai-shek agreed, but he intended, after victory, to recover the new territories directly from the Japanese. However, when Japan surrendered, Chiang Kai-shek did not take back the new territories. It was the British who accepted the Japanese surrender of Hong Kong. The nationalists only sent their chief negotiator, Major General Pan Wah-kuo, to the ceremony. Today, the colonel's son, Pan Han Tang, says his father had never forgotten that moment.
I think deep in his heart, maybe, because he's a person of a very strong patriotism, and he likes to see that Hong Kong to get back to the hand of the Chinese people in time. He thinks maybe it's a time for the Hong Kong to input as a strong economic power to China.
Just before Japan's surrender, crack nationalist troops were stationed in East China and Guangxi province, while the nearest British soldiers were in the Philippines. This secret document, declassified only last year, showed the British were very worried the nationalists might beat them to Hong Kong to fill the administrative vacuum left by the Japanese surrender.
We have further in mind that if such irregulars did succeed in bringing off a successful coup in Hong Kong, the Chinese government would be likely to sponsor them, and we should not only have lost whatever remaining prestige we have in China, but we should have an extremely difficult and embarrassing task in getting the Chinese out of the place.
But as the British fleet was being dispatched to Hong Kong, a new president took office in Washington, and he did not support the return of the new territories to China. At the same time, Chiang Kai-shek needed Allied backing in his civil war against the Communists, so he decided to put Hong Kong on the back burner. This was Chiang's last directive to Pan Wah-kuo.
Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang says, I think the time is not mature yet, so let's wait. I think that's the final decision from the Generalissimo. Chiang Kai-shek was not quite happy about this situation, but finally he decided to go along with Mr. Roosevelt and Winston Churchill because China needs their support. And from the American viewpoint, maybe they need UK more than China in order to balance the international political situation.
As the communists won repeated battles against the nationalists, Britain started worrying whether it could perpetuate colonial rule in Hong Kong.
Troops of Mao Zedong marched into Shanghai unopposed. Within weeks, they were at the gates of Hong Kong. Troops went out from Britain to reinforce the garrison. Hong Kong was determined to stay British.
But the communists stopped at Shenzhen. There were several reasons why the Chinese communists did not take back Hong Kong, even with an East-West Cold War and Western embargo on China.
Hong Kong was a very important regional headquarters for the communists. Hong Kong was being used by the Western powers as a spy hole watching into China. Hong Kong was also China's spy hole for the rest of the world. Apart from the political value in the reconstruction of the Chinese economy, Hong Kong was also an important source of revenue. And in any event, the Chinese Communist government decided they could raise the future of Hong Kong at any time they want. And in the long term, time could only be in China's favor. So why rush?
They could take it back at any time. There would be a price they would have to pay internationally, perhaps, and maybe on the spot.
Beijing soon devised a long-term policy for Hong Kong. It was long-term planning and optimal utilization. So Hong Kong continued as a British colony. As China was ravaged by political, economic and social upheavals. And fleeing the chaos, the mainlanders who flooded Hong Kong in the 1950s gave the colony the impetus for development.
Although that China didn't take over Hong Kong in 1945, and we found that this is a kind of a fortune and luck for all the Chinese people. And by chance or by mistake, whatever. But for all the Chinese people, I think this is luck.
But as Hong Kong progressed by leaps and bounds, the 99-year lease of the new territories was running out.
Something had to be done to get clear about what would happen in 97.
We had, for the first time in China, a pragmatic, practical government under Deng Xiaoping. Before that, we had had some very violent regimes in China with whom negotiation would have been quite impossible, I think, or certainly very dangerous. Now, with Deng Xiaoping, we felt that we could talk in a reasonable way.
The historic meeting between Governor Murray MacLehose and Chinese paramount leader Deng Xiaoping was the first ever initiated by the British Hong Kong government to discuss Hong Kong affairs with Beijing. MacLehose said he only intended to discuss new territories' land leases.
There's a body of people who think I was terribly stupid to raise this whole question of 1997. In fact, I didn't raise it, Deng did. And he said, well, 1997, that may seem rather a long time ahead, but I expect before then there will be discussions of some sort. Meanwhile, he asked me to do everything I could to encourage Hong Kong people to invest in China. I said that Hong Kong's ability to make a contribution to the modernization program depended on Hong Kong's prosperity. If Hong Kong is very poor, obviously it couldn't make any contribution. And its prosperity depended to a very large extent on confidence, international confidence and local confidence in it. And I gave as an example of this the question of these new territories leases, that if, as the time drew nearer for these leases to have a very short duration, obviously confidence would evaporate.
And we thought we would try, first of all, to see whether there could be a quiet, tacit agreement not to go too deeply into it, and to allow the land leases to be extended and a British administration at least to continue.
MacLehose recalled the meeting was inconclusive, but he said Deng Xiaoping did take the occasion to lay investors' hearts at ease.
He said there could be capitalism in Hong Kong and socialism in China well into the next century. And I must say that struck a chord with me.
At the time, Beijing had already formulated the concepts of one country, two systems and Hong Kong people ruling Hong Kong. In 1982, as Chinese and British leaders prepared to meet, China's position became very clear.
如果是不受惠，我们确实是变成第二个李鸿章了，是吧？我们中国新中国没那么窝囊，是吧？没那么窝囊，我们一定要受惠。
At the time, Britain was winning a war with Argentina over the Falklands, another British colony. And Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher went to Beijing flushed with victory.
I think she was, in her post-Falklands mood at first, inclined to see the matter in terms of, too black and white, a feeling that we mustn't give way at any point to China.
Mrs. Thatcher thought of returning the leased new territories and keeping Hong Kong Island and Kowloon south of Boundary Street. Foreign Office officials had to show her a map to explain why that wasn't possible.
The dividing line ran through the middle of Kowloon, that all the utilities were in the wrong part, that the population would all congregate in the remaining 8%. The whole thing was not on.
Britain had another strategy, and it was prepared to confront China with it. Coming up after the break. On the eve of Hong Kong's handover to China, both its stock and property markets have been hitting record highs, and immigrants are returning in droves. More than a dozen years ago, when Hong Kong's fate was being negotiated, few could have imagined this. Margaret Thatcher's visit to Beijing was a prelude to Sino-British talks on Hong Kong. Deng Xiaoping also told her China would take back the territory. But Mrs. Thatcher argued that Hong Kong Island and Kowloon had been ceded to Britain.
One point about the treaties, I believe they are valid as international law. And you can't, if countries try just to abrogate treaties like that, then it is very serious indeed. Because if a country will not stand by one treaty, it would not stand by another treaty.
The 鸦片战争啊，3个和平条约，我们并不要求现在的英国人民替他们这个祖先负这个责任。但是如果现在还是坚持3个不平等条约，那么他就跟他那个祖先一样。
Formal talks on Hong Kong's fate began in 1983. The British proposed giving up sovereignty in exchange for continued administration.
We tried at first to say, all right, we will accept Chinese titular sovereignty, but we will retain British administration. The object was that naturally we wished to retain as much control as possible.
The advice we had from Hong Kong people, from EXCO and EDGCO, was that the British administration was the glue, as it were, that held Hong Kong together, and that the systems would only function if Britain had responsibility for the administration.
那时候有个说法，好比是一个公司啊，这个你公司董事长是中国，这个经理是英国，这个国家的领土不可以给公司比，是不是？
Look, Hong Kong works, it thrives. It does that because it has British administration. That is why international investors have confidence in it. A change of regime could destroy that confidence.
它作为在运动的军事基地、政治基地、经济基地、特务基地，你看对它的作用多大？
The negotiations stalled. Hong Kong people became very nervous. A crisis erupted in September 1983. Hong Kong people never had a chance to participate in the talks to decide their own future, nor were they allowed a referendum on their own fate, as in some other colonies. Gibraltar, in the south of Spain, with only 30,000 people, had a similar situation. 30 years ago, in 1967, Spain wanted to recover its sovereignty, so Britain held a referendum in Gibraltar.
Gibraltar voted to retain its links with Britain with a decisive 12,138 votes. Spain only received 44 votes.
Now, it was always clear that that would not be possible for Hong Kong because of the Chinese attitude. There was no question whatever that China would not permit it. So what could Britain do?
他反对英国人。 香港人那个作为一张牌，在这个作为谈判当中的一个筹码。
At the time, only traditional pro-Beijing groups openly supported reunification with China. IXCO and LegCo members did not, and they lobbied London against it.
港人治港，沒有前例可換，而基本上社會主義同資本主義嘅制度。 有好多地方可能產生矛盾。
Many of the members of the Executive Council at the time of the Joint Declaration and negotiations now support Chinese attitude. Well, that's understandable. I can understand that. People have to adjust to reality.
The reality then was that Britain would have to capitulate.
But it's right for me to tell you now that it would not be realistic to think of an agreement that provides for continued British administration in Hong Kong after 1997.
China never wavered from its stand, but it says it did take British interests into account in the talks.
原来的华侨银行可以继续发行，你比如还有这个航空民航，是吧？民航的有关规定，也照顾了养殖产产地。
The talks concluded after 22 rounds.
秋天是收获的季节。
The Sino-British Joint Declaration was signed in December 1984 and was well received.
When you had the Joint Declaration signed, it did two things. Firstly, it set a date certain, a definite date for the transfer of sovereignty of the 30th, midnight on the 30th of June. And it also stated, for the first time from the Chinese, that Britain would remain responsible for the administration of Hong Kong until that time, and that China would give its cooperation. Never had that before in writing, in formal statements. Secondly, there was the provision in the Joint Declaration that the legislature would be constituted by elections after the transfer of sovereignty.
So British rule in Hong Kong had to end, and Hong Kong would become a special administrative region of China. The day of reunification is here.
我这个人生活的这个历程啊，是从我们民族灾难最深重的这个时候，啊，一直到不断的取得这个胜利，一直到我们把香港收回，是吧？这应该说是我们这一代人的幸运，是吧？应该说是，这一生无憾，是吧？无憾。
I think for British governments and for the British people, the idea of handing over the fate of 6 million people who had been brought up under a Western system of values and freedoms while retaining their Chineseness and handing it over to a government which, for all its economic reforms, is still a one-party communist government, has not been easy.
Government House will be turned into a museum.
Oh, that'll go. I don't think that will...
No.
That belongs to the British government.
But the last colonial governor of Hong Kong, Chris Patten, is shipping home some of the antique furniture he's bought in Hong Kong.
I think that there's an elegance and a stylishness about Chinese furniture.
This portrait of Queen Elizabeth will also be sent back to Britain. But Chris Patten hopes British rule will leave some lasting legacies.
This has been one of the freest and most decent and cleanest places in Asia or beyond. I think if people hold on to those values, I think if people hold on to those principles and those ways of doing things, there is every reason why Hong Kong in the future should be an even finer place. I think the greatest contribution is that it's given the Chinese people of Hong Kong the opportunity to be themselves. It's a Chinese success story, a Hong Kong Chinese success story, but one, I think, to which Britain has contributed good public administration and the rule of law.
Well, I think at least 85 to 90% is the Chinese people effort. They are well known for its adaptability. That is the best assets to start with. And that they're prepared to do any work change.
Hong Kong people's diligence, Britain's systems, China's historical development, its reforms and opening up, these have all made Hong Kong what it is today.
它也应该是公正持正，我们又不是把它打败了，但是这在中国来说，我们也是吸取了100多年来的耻辱，是吧？在他来说，也是丢掉这么一个殖民统治的这么一个包袱。
I don't think we have anything much to condemn ourselves about. I think we managed pretty well up to the last 5 years.
In the last 5 years of British rule, Governor Chris Patten's electoral reforms and his amendments of draconian laws caused a rancorous dispute between China and Britain.
他这样做怎么能够光荣？只能求这个表面上的光荣，不能求到实质上的光荣。
When the electoral system was changed from the understandings and agreements with China, then, of course, the through train was cancelled. So that's why we're where we are today.
People in Hong Kong now know the difference between a fair election and one which is, shall we say, less fair. So I am perfectly happy to stand on our record on democratic accountability and on our record on civil liberties.
Sino-British disputes over Hong Kong will soon be history.
For myself and my family, it will inevitably be a moment of some sadness when the flags change and when we go on Britannia and sail down the harbour with the lights and the fireworks and the crowds. But on the other hand, I will think that it's not the end of the story for Hong Kong. I will think that it is the beginning of a new chapter.
Hong Kong's long-term interests and China's long-term interests are the same, because what is good for Hong Kong is good for China. What is good for China is very good for Hong Kong. If we have the long-term interest, that is the most paramount. On short-term basis, there will be disagreement, and we'll quietly talk through them and work it out. I'm very confident of that.